Welcome back to another episode of Utility Mode, where performance meets real life. I'm Sophie Curtin, elite rugby league athlete, sports nutritionist, and student dietitian. The 2026 NRLW season is almost here, and while trial matches are over, they never fully tell the story. They can give us some valuable clues and insight about what teams are working on, which players are pushing for selection, and what trends could shape the season ahead. Today, we're going to be breaking down the trial games, looking at key team performances, some positional changes, standout players, any potential injury concerns, and the biggest talking points from each club before round one. Remember, trial football isn't about perfection. It's about experimenting, building combinations, and identifying what works and what doesn't work before the competition starts. So let's get into it with the Roosters versus the Sharks. So Sydney Roosters looked calm as always, despite some early pressure from the Sharks with some early points. We saw throughout the entire game some of their key players stepping up, one of them being Jocelyn Kelleher having plenty of time to kick and repeatedly producing long high bombs, putting their outside backs for Cronulla under pressure. Despite the lack of kick pressure from Cronulla, they were still able to control field position early, but with some valuable interchanges from the Roosters, they were able to regain that field control and eventually regain the lead with their points. Jada Taylor received some valuable game time following Emma Veren's pregnancy announcement and after a couple of long-term injuries. So it was nice to see her finally get some consistent game time and really show what she's made of. It'll be interesting to see how she fits into the squad moving forward, obviously with the recent signing of Maddie Ashby and a couple of other really strong outside backs in their squad. Hopefully she can handle the physicality, still being quite a young player in their squad and quite young in terms of NRLW experience, despite being in the squads for the last couple of years. We did see the Roosters able to score back-to-back tries after sustained pressure and penalties. So going into the first third break, I think Cronulla were winning 4-0. Into the second, third, as I said, Roosters were able to score back-to-back tries, quickly turning that to an 8-4 lead. And then with some really strong interchanges, we saw Roosters just pile on the points. So they ended up winning 28-4. And so mentioning some of the key players for Roosters, we saw the 7-star Soraya Paki make her impact off the bench from her return from Rugby Sevens. Then also 7 unanswered tries, as I said. Sharks scored first to lead 4-0, and then going into the second and third, Roosters were able to just pile on those points. As I said, without any tries or any points returned back. And to be completely honest, the Sharks try was a little bit of a sloppy one. It wasn't from anything fancy. It was just quick play of the ball short side, a couple of good offloads, and we were able to score in the corner. But it was really good to see Paki get involved early and set the tone in the contest with some strong contact, which I noted throughout the entire game was really physical from both teams, which was great. We see Jess Surges having obviously some speed and strength down that right side, allowing Brady Parker to score. Between the posts, as always, very strong outside backs in the Roosters squad. And then again, 7 unanswered tries. They were able to score with a cutout pass to Logan Fletcher, who was able to score through a couple of defenders in the corner, which was great. Parker and Tanisha Gray were the next to score before a really, really good try from a kick, perfectly weighted kick from Keely Simpson, which allowed, as I said, Parker to go down almost untouched in that left corner, which was great. We saw Jazzy Strange draw the fence in as well on that left edge after being put back on in the third and final third, putting the young winger down in the side line, which was really good. We saw some really good starts from some of the Sharks players though. So the halfback Shante Kiriaratu, having just played for Queensland, she had some really good control of the squad early on. But as I said, kind of once the interchanges happened, she was out for the remainder of the game. I'm assuming more just a load thing than a performance thing, obviously having played Origin. She's got some game fitness. It was more just about building those combinations with her on that right edge. She was replaced by the Australian Sevens co-captain Maddie Ashby, who we've seen in the last week or two make the announcement that she is signed with the Cronulla Sharks in their NRLW. This is her first game of rugby league since 2018. So quite a while since she's played rugby league. So it'll be interesting to see how she fits into their squad. She came on as 14 and, as I said, ended up playing in the halves on that right edge. So, yeah, very interesting to see how their squad is tested with quite a lot of young players coming through their squad, and also a very, very strong middle pack. They had starting Ellie Johnson, Caitlin Johnson, and Tegan Dimmick as their starting three middles, which is unheard of, allowing Quincy Dodd to obviously run a little bit of amok early in that game with some quick play the balls and very physical contact in defence. It was interesting to also see, I guess, Caitlin Johnson's return following pregnancy. She was very damaging early, and as I said, the first 20 minutes they kind of dominated field position and dominated the physicality, and we saw with obviously some less experienced middles come onto the field and less experienced halves and things like that come onto the field. The Roosters were able to dominate in that middle third period, scoring back-to-back, as I said, receiving penalties and just walking them up the field. But mostly I think the Cronulla weren't able to slow down the play the balls enough, and as I said, Roosters just marched up the field and were able to just score points on the back of that. I think personally that the Roosters middles in that middle third and second third really bullied the interchange middles for Cronulla. So it'll definitely be interesting to see how that unfolds throughout the season. Despite having a massive forward pack early on, they were able to hold that and match that with the Roosters early, which was great. But through repeat errors, a little bit of fatigue, and some interchanges, it's interesting to see, or it will be interesting to see how they go playing other teams if that middle third of the game where you've got those interchange players coming on, if they're able to maintain the same intensity. So it'll be, as I said, we'll have to watch out for the fitness of the middles, and then also how that rotation impacts the depth of the squad and the performance of the squad. Just a key point for Cronulla, we also have to watch out for Tiana Penatani-Gray coming back in after injury during her Origin series. Moving on to the Newcastle Raiders game. We saw an interesting a game there. So we had Newcastle defeating Canberra 22-10. So Bortho kind of had the opposite approach to some of the other NRLW squads, starting his less experienced players and the development players early, and then transitioning into his more experienced players and middles later on in the game, which was interesting to see. But did basically have his full squad in the trial. Obviously, a few new faces in the Canberra team as well, so it's interesting to see how they all fit in, as well as the Knights having lost and gained a couple of players and some interesting player position swaps. It's definitely going to be an interesting season. So similar to the previous game, the middle dominated quite early for the Newcastle Knights. As I said, they were able to build pressure really early, get repeat sets, and just pour on the points from a couple of soft tries, but from the sustained possession, Raiders just couldn't keep up. And with their really strong spine combinations there with Kira and a couple of other really experienced players there, they were able to stay settled, build pressure, and just manage the game really well. Obviously, from their experience, you'd hope that they'd be able to do that. So with Kira at 7, as I said, Higgins at 9. But we did see an interesting change in their spine as well. We saw Bo spend a little bit of time at 6 with Lillian White at fullback to start the game before switching to fullback later in the game. So it'll be interesting to see how that unfolds going into the season, and whether that was just more of a management of position and game time, or if that was kind of a little thing that they had up their sleeve and they wanted to trial out. I know she's played 6 in a couple of other games before, but it was more out of necessity and injury rather than preference. So it was good to see them trialling some new positions to see how it worked. I thought Lillian played really well when she was at fullback. But as I said, the experience through their spine just absolutely dominated Raiders quite early. And so we'll see if those positional experiments continue into round 1 or not. We saw early on, as I mentioned, tough first half defensively for the Raiders with a lot of their inexperienced players starting. So we saw Evie McGrath at 6 and Sede at 7. And then later on we saw, as I said, more of their experienced players come on and really direct them around the park. Newcastle rolled through their middle, building pressure early, as I said. A few repeat sets and a few soft tries. And then just some, I guess, bad luck, but also inexperience with the Raiders coming out of their own end. Silly things like passing the ball into the post and having it land straight into the Newcastle's hands. Following a few tries and physicality, they weren't able to slow any play the balls down and just constantly on the back foot. But the Raiders fullback early on in the game, I thought had a great opener and showed her speed and footwork in the trial and was able to get some open space. Going into the second half, as I said, Canberra were able to return some of those points, having more of their experienced players on, and even kept Newcastle scoreless in the second half. So if that's not an indication, I don't know what is. Again, whether or not Newcastle had their strongest squad on in the second half is contestable. But again, Raiders were able to claw back some points with more of their experienced players and what you would imagine going into round 1. Some of the key players like your Maima Taufas, your Zaharas, and all of those other players. Some of the new recruits that they have as well joined. So we saw players like Gallagher joining in on the squad from the Dragons, I believe. Here we go. I've got a list here. So we've got, Bobby Law from the Dragons, Sheridan Gallagher from the Knights. We saw Evie McGrath, as I mentioned, Charlotte Basham from the Dragons as well, Crystal Blackwell. So quite a few new faces spread across the team as well. And having lost Mona Lisa Soliola for personal reasons on that edge, it'll be interesting to see who they find to replace that edge spot. I also thought Grace Kemp was really physical in the game and had some really good carries when she came on. So that's another, obviously, experienced middle and quite a big physical middle. So it was good to see in the second half them kind of come back and show a little bit more resilience in their team, and with the noticeable difference when those more experienced players were introduced. So it was a much stronger second half performance, but it'll be interesting to see going into round 1 if they can start their games really strong with that more experienced squad. Now looking at the Warriors-Broncos game. So this was probably the trial that I was most looking forward to watching. Unfortunately, it was hard to find video footage of this game. All of the other games were on NRL.com. However, this one, I believe, was live streamed on YouTube, but I wasn't able to find it afterwards to re-watch. But from what I read, it was quite a close game. It was played in New Zealand, so Brisbane travelled to New Zealand to play. It ended up being a 12-10 win to Brisbane. But from what I heard and from what I saw, the Warriors led for most of the game. So Brisbane scored near the post very late in the second half and were able to drag the win. But yeah, as I said, leading until the dying moments against the defending premiers is a very, very impressive trial game. And I know obviously trials aren't always the best indicator for round 1 performances, but with my predictions in the last episode having Warriors as the smoky premiers for 2026, I'm very impressed, I guess, with the performance and a very, very encouraging trial performance. So holding Brisbane out for long periods of time, regardless of what time of the season it is very, very hard to do. And after narrowly, after losing 12-10, it's very, very positive for them going into the season. And I guess it shows a stronger preparation compared to 2025 when they didn't have that trial match. So going into, again, the defending premiers with the Roosters in 2025 in round 1 after not having a trial and still being able to kind of go tit for tat for, 3/4 of the game is really, really good. And I guess with Brisbane, it showed their patience and composure under pressure with the time or the clock running down and being down a little bit of points. So being able to, as I said, show patience and even know everything that didn't go their way, they were able to maintain obviously quite a great performance and a benchmark club and a benchmark squad with a few new additions. So as I said, I can't comment on too many positional and specific moments from the game because I wasn't able to watch it and it was hard to find footage of the game. But again, looking at New Zealand's performance in terms of the scoreline and the preparation and how that translates into hopefully some early season wins compared to last year. It took them a few weeks to kind of find their groove and get into the game. So very, very well done for New Zealand for almost defeating Brisbane in the trials. But I'm sure they had a very, very physical game looking at both of their squads. Probably the most shocking results of the trials, I think, was the Dragons and Tigers game. It ended up being quite a bit of a blowout. I saw some contradicting results. NRL said the game was 24-8 West Tigers way, but online I believe it was 32-8 as reported by the West Tigers and a couple of other sources. So what a turnaround for West, obviously, after having a couple of really rough seasons over the last few years, being the Wooden Spooners, but after some really, really good recruitment in the off-season and some really strong middles and key players in the spine, they were able to put a performance together in the trial. And as I said, I know that's not everything, but it's a good indicator to see that hopefully the Tigers are having a better season in 2026. So with the game, I was able to watch this one and they just dominated the field position really early. They pinned the Dragons in their own end and were able to get repeat sets, whether that was through kicks or whether it was through physical defence, dragging them back into their own line. The Tigers' middles just walked up the field. And also Dragons were giving away really cheap ball. And so this probably contributed to their fatigue, having to defend their line over and over again. But from the first half alone, they gave away 3 penalties from roll balls. There was poor passes from hooker that landed on the ground in their own end. And then also I found that they were constantly trying to run around them. And all that worked on a few occasions. You obviously can't run around them if you haven't gone forward first. So I thought that their defence was poor. They just didn't have the physicality and contact. Then they were losing their tackles and then they were constantly on the back foot. Because they were losing the tackles, the Tigers were able to get away a lot of offloads and play a lot of second phase play, which obviously had them further on the back foot. And because of the fatigue, they weren't able to maintain good line speed, and then that obviously just compounded into their attack as well, which I thought looked a little bit clunky at times. But Tigers showed some great attack and great defense really early, and were consistent pinning the Dragons basically in their own half for the entire first half. The Tigers have been, I guess, notorious for offloads, having some of the highest offload numbers in almost every season and every game, with players like Christian Pio and Kezi being a little bit taller and also having quite physical carries are able to get offloads away. So I'm hoping this gives them a little bit of confidence going into round one. The Dragons, not so much. As I said, discipline and ball control hurt them severely, and those cheap possession errors just gave them more reasons to be fatigued. And then that flowed on into their attack, looking a little bit clunky and disconnected at times, and then losing physicality battles. As I said, just walked the Tigers up the field. So it'll be interesting to see how their combinations go into the first round, because there is a very, very, very young squad. So yeah, it'll definitely be interesting to see how that impacts round one selections. They did score a couple of tries later in the game, but as I said, the 2 tries compared to, all of the others with no kicks as well. So with, I guess, the Dragons' gains, they did do a lot of recruiting in the off-season, but I'm just not sure they were in the right positions to, direct the team, a very young team, around the park. So they got Brooke Anderson, which was obviously a great score, Montana Clifford from the Tigers, Montana Hudson from Broncos, Talia Fuimaono from the Titans, who else? Shanae Suzolka from the Broncos. They lost Racine McGregor to the Tigers. They lost Shanae Lindell to the Tigers. They lost Bobby Law to the Raiders, as I said earlier. Lost Basham to the Raiders, and also Indy Bostock to the Titans. So quite a few changes in their squad, but a very, very young squad nonetheless. So it'll be probably a building season for them, I would imagine, going into the next year. I think it might be a bit of a tough season for Dragons, purely just based on the fact that they've got a little bit of a smaller team and also a very, very young squad. So hopefully going into round one, they're able to get a little bit more cohesion and a little bit more confidence in their attack to get a little bit more points. I'm not sure who they're up against in round one, but as I said, I think it might be a bit of a tough year for them. Nearly at the end, we've got, I think this is the last game, the Cowboys and Titans, with some interesting positional changes again. So we saw the results for that game with Cowboys defeating Titans 24-16. Titans kind of took the lead early with their more experienced squad, and then the Cowboys were kind of able to, as I said, score quite a few points later in the game to break up the lead. So we saw Georgia Hale spending a bit of time at hooker to start off the game was a really interesting selection decision. Obviously, defensively, that doesn't really change for her. She's a defensive workhorse, but she did transition later into to 13 later in the game. So that was a bit of a shock. But yeah, to see her in the lock, she definitely looked a little bit more comfortable there than she did at hooker. I don't think she's going to be anything super fancy at hooker, but just does her job really, really well. Holds the defensive, I guess, efforts and team in the middle. And then also just really good service, clear communication, and just nailing her role there. I don't think she's going to be a super fast or creative hooker or anything like that, but I definitely think she's going to get them into the game physically, I guess, kind of handle some contact and then allow, the younger hooker to come on later on into the game. I did see, speaking of hookers, Emil Manzelmann. What a player. Definitely caused plenty of problems around the ruck. Early on, running holes through the Gold Coast, and then eventually as well scoring a couple of tries. But yeah, she's a freak. I can't wait to see, I guess, where she goes in the future in the game. She's already done so much, despite being such a young player. It was really good to see Vani back. Although she wasn't in her traditional position of fullback, she was playing on the right wing, I believe. So after having a child, she's done really well to come back for the 2026 season. And speaking of that right edge, we saw a really, really strong right edge attack for the Titans, creating multiple line breaks and multiple tries, which was really good. And their offloads as well were quite good and generated a lot of second phase opportunities, which I think the Titans were able to take full advantage of. More positional changes, which I thought was interesting. We saw Chapo at left centre and not at the wing at fullback, which we had seen previously. So some of those combinations will be interesting to see whether they remain going into round one or if it was more of a trial to see how it would go. More on the Cowboys' points. It showed some of their inexperience in the halves showed at times. And also, again, with some new faces into the team. And we saw some of their young middles coming through, and wow, some of them are very physically strong and very big and powerful and just ran amok at times through the middle there after some interchanges and some fatigue into the game. But with that came some poor ball control, which kind of stalled their momentum a little bit. And also one of the Cowboys halves had a Category 1 HIA, which obviously disrupted their attacking shape and continuity. But we did see the Cowboys 6 being replaced by Cowboys 14, who played at the Warriors last year more in a 9 role than a 6 role. But it was good to see her on the edge and having a little bit of a go. We saw Margot Vella, who was at the Dragons only a few weeks ago. Sorry, not the Dragons. She was originally at the Dragons a couple of years ago before doing her ACL. Then she signed with Cronulla. And then recently a shock move to Cowboys. And we saw her take the field as well on the edge. So that's an interesting recruitment decision on both teams' part. Not sure what happened there. I haven't heard anything or seen anything to give away why the move. But yeah, definitely a very late transfer in preseason. But it'll be really good to see Cowboys, after a strong season last year, making the finals, whether the development in their halves and how they can kind of manage any injuries and the depth in their squad. If, as I said, penalties, suspensions, concussions, injuries affects their squad. I think the biggest takeaway from all of the trials was knowing that the middles winning still wins games. So we saw with the Roosters, Knights, Tigers, and the Broncos, all of them generated momentum through the middle before the edges were able to capitalise. And I think that remains true regardless of what level of footy you play at. If your middles or your engine room wins and generate momentum, you're able to kind of capitalise on the back of that and get your strike players on the edges to score plenty of points. Secondly, I think some clubs are really experimenting with some key positions. So examples, Georgia Hale at hooker, we saw Bo Vetti Welsh at 5'8", and some new spine combinations across several clubs, which was really interesting. Again, this is always something that is really important for NRLW, and looking at the depth of squads is going to be critical as ever. I definitely think the biggest difference in several of the games and the results was once the benches were emptied and the rotations started. That's where we saw the biggest changes in competitiveness and physicality and skill and execution there. So, as I said, something like the Cronulla Sharks, who were in the lead, and then their bench rotation came on and they just weren't able to hold on and just weren't able to compete with the Roosters bench. I discussed this last week briefly with Emily about the physicality and growth of the game, but it looks to be more physical again than ever. Almost every game had quite a few aggressive tackles, dominant carries, and fast play the ball speed, which is obviously very important in our game. So it was great to see really aggressive contact and some really strong defensive decisions and some really dominant carries that bumping players off, finding in front, and generating some play the ball speed. And then lastly, and probably most excitingly, the Warriors looked great, and probably the biggest positive surprise coming from the trials was how competitive they looked against the defending premiers. So I'm going to leave it at that. I'm going to keep an eye out for some more insight into the squads for round one, and I'll keep you updated on that. But in the next episode, I believe we're probably going to look at some more player movements in depth over all of the squads and discuss some of the movements that have been predicted for 2027 already, even though this season hasn't even started. So thank you again for listening, and enjoy the rest of your day. Cheers.